All right, hey, good morning. Hey, great to see you. I tell you, I just love being here. I love getting here and seeing people come in, and it feels like family. I love meeting new folks. I see some faces out there that I don't know, and hopefully maybe after the service, I'll be out in the foyer, and I'd love to get to meet you and say hello to you. You know, this morning we close out a sermon series in the book of Ruth called From Ruin to Redemption. Ruin to Redemption. There's been a progression in our protagonist's life. We've seen it kind of unfold over these last weeks. Ruth is the kind of focal person in our story. Her life fell into ruin when both her father-in-law and her husband passed away. She'd been married for about 10 years. They were living in a foreign country. She had been unable to have children all of those years. She was now a young widow with no means of support. And in the depths of her grief and sorrow, she was desperate. She was destitute. She was experiencing ruin. She followed her mother-in-law, Naomi, back to Bethlehem from that country of Moab, came back to Israel, to Bethlehem, and in an amazing act of faith and sacrifice, what Ruth did, she leaves everything behind and entrusted it herself to Naomi's God, to the one and true God. God had already been at work in her life, and the circumstances that were all around her. She went to pick up leftover grain in the field and ended up meeting a man named Boaz. And we're going to see his life. A man who would bring her in and care for her and bring her into refuge. He'd bring her under his care and protection, provide for her. She would move from ruin to refuge. But the journey wasn't over. Weeks later, she would venture out in the middle of the night and go to the place where Boaz and his workers were threshing grain. She traveled in the night, risking safety, and she finds herself there at the threshing floor. She waits till he falls asleep. She's there at his feet, and he wakes up. God's at work in Boaz's life, just as he's at work in her life. He wakes up and sees her, and he promises her. He promises her that he would give her rest. He would bring her out of the chaos to a place where she could find rest. She went from ruins to refuge, and then now to rest. But that journey isn't over yet. It isn't over now. We come to this last chapter today, chapter 4. If you have your Bibles and you can turn there, chapter 4 in the book of Ruth. We won't be reading much of it, but I'll refer to a couple of passages in it. I want you to look there. If you have one of the black Bibles, I believe it's on page 224, Ruth chapter 4. It's the conclusion of our love story. In this chapter, we find this word, or some form of this word, redeem. It's mentioned 12 times in this chapter. So the author is trying to get our attention about redemption. He's bringing it home, giving our focus to this word redemption. In fact, redemption is the final destination of Ruth's journey from ruin to redemption. But it's just not her destination. Friends, we've been singing about it all morning. It's our destination. You know, that word redeem, it means to rescue, to restore, to save, to deliver. We first find the word redemption. We see it on full display in the book of Exodus, in the people of Israel. The Israelites were enslaved by the Egyptians. God had raised up a deliverer in the name of Moses. Moses would lead the people out of Israel, or out of Egyptian bondage, to a land of blessing and hope, a land that we sang about, a promised land. And from that moment forward, God was known as Redeemer. He saved his people. He restored his people. He delivered his people. He rescued his people. And God also wanted the people of Israel to not only know a Redeemer, but to live life as redeemers. He put in place through the laws of Moses, laws that would protect the poor and the destitute. You know, when they got into this promised land, the land after they conquered it, it was given out to families and to people. They had a land. They got to possess that land and take ownership of it. All of the people of Israel were given a parcel of land. And it was to stay in the family. A father would pass it down to his son and his son to his son and on down the line. It stayed in the family's name. But if a man died leaving his wife without children, what the law says that a kinsman or a relative, the closest relative, would step in and purchase or redeem that land to save that land in the family's name, to keep it there in the family. That relative or kinsman would serve as a redeemer of that widow, restoring the family namesake and, of course, that inheritance. And now as we move deeper into chapter 4 of Ruth, Boaz is prepared to step in as that kinsman redeemer for Ruth and Naomi, who had lost their fathers and had lost their husbands and had no children. They were destitute. They were in ruins. And Boaz comes as that kinsman redeemer. So what Boaz does, he makes his way out into the city gates, we read in chapter 4. That's where all the kind of business took place. The guys would gather out there, and he makes his way out there. And sure enough, that there was a kinsman, there was a relative that was closer to Ruth and Naomi than he was. This kinsman redeemer had the first right to the land. Naomi was in a position that she had to sell the land, or at least the rights to work that land in order to survive. She was so in need, she had to get rid of that land. So this kinsman redeemer was going to come in and step in. So Boaz goes, and he begins to share with this guy. In fact, he just happens to come by. He happens to come by, and he says, "Hey." In fact, your translations, he's referred to as friend, but in the original language, there's no name there. It's not even friend. It really means so-and-so. He's like, hey, so-and-so, hey, come here. I need to share something with you. We need to talk business. So they sit down there, and Boaz begins to share with this nameless person that Naomi is getting ready to sell the land, and that he, as the kinsman redeemer, can purchase that land. So Mr. So-and-so, he had that first right to redeem the land. So Mr. So-and-so realized that because Naomi was a widow and had no grandchildren, if he bought the land, that would be gravy to him. He's like, hey, that becomes my land. I get a little extra bonus here. And so he looks over to Boaz and says, sure, I'll redeem it for Naomi. Then Boaz shares the rest of the story. Now, so-and-so, not only do you get the land, you get Ruth. You know, that widow. And so what you'll do, you'll buy the land, but you'll also need to marry Ruth and then bear her children. And oh, by the way, so-and-so, she comes with her mother. So you'll get a mother-in-law. And so you probably need to build a little mother-in-law house out back. And Mr. So-and-so thinks about it pretty quickly, and he's like, I think I'll pass. In fact, go ahead and you can redeem it. You're the next in line. Why don't you redeem the land? And he goes on his way, and we never hear from Mr. So-and-so again. So Boaz becomes that kinsman redeemer. He becomes the redeemer for Ruth, for Naomi. And what I want us to do, I want us to pick up the story here in verse 13, Ruth chapter 4, starting in verse 13. The love story comes to a climax. So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception. The Lord did this. 10 years or so, she couldn't get pregnant. Now, the Lord blesses. She conceives, and she bore a son. Verse 14. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer. And may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you as a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him." Then Naomi took the child and laid him on her lap and became his nurse. And the women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, "A son has been born to Naomi." And they named him Obed. He was the father of Jesse, the father of David. So Ruth has arrived. She has arrived from ruin to redemption. Ruth's life had been completely transformed. She went from ruin to redemption, from destitution to deliverance, from grief to grace. She went from foreigner to family, from widow to wife, from barren to a baby born. But what in the world does Ruth's journey, what does her journey from ruin to redemption mean for you and me today? How does this speak to us? Is it just some songs that we can sing on a Sunday morning? Or what do we do with this? What is God speaking to us in this book of Ruth? How does redemption play out into our own lives and in our trials? I think Ruth, one of the key things here, that Ruth shows us that God never forgets. Friends, he never forgets. He never forgets us. In every chapter we have seen of Ruth, we've seen God providentially at work. He's caring and lovingly orchestrating everything in her life. He's working in Ruth's life, in Naomi's life, and in Boaz's life. He's working in every situation and that comes up, every circumstance, the good, the bad, the ugly, the painful. He's working in the famine. He's working in their loss and their grief. He's working in Moab. He's working in Bethlehem. He's working out there in that field. He's working at the threshing floor. He's working there at the gate. God has been with them all the way through it. God has not forgotten Naomi and Ruth. He was working with them and was working in them, and he was working all around them. Friend, God's redemption runs deep. God's redemption runs deep. And in the same way, God has not forgotten you. He is working in your life right now. He is all around you, every circumstance. He is working through the difficulties, through those glorious moments, through the health struggles, through the loss, through the challenges that you face, through the disappointments, through the heartache. Through it all, God is there. He has not forgotten you. Friend, his redemption runs deep. Friend, when tragedy comes into your life, when the storms of life blow into your world like a hurricane, when loss hits you, followed by that grief that's sharp and edgy, when disappointments hit, when illness invades, when your marriage is battered, or any other trial seeks to bring you down, you need to take hold of this truth as if your very life depended on it. God has not forgotten you. God is at work in your life. His redemption runs deep in the trial. Friend, I know it can feel like God has just disappeared. He's abandoned you. He has forgotten. It feels that way. You read in the Psalms, David cries out, "Oh God, where are you?" He feels it in his struggles. It's real. And I think when you feel like tossing in the towel, when you feel like walking away or giving up, that's the time. That's the time when we most need to not walk away, but walk toward him. Isaiah 41:10 says, "Fear not, for I am with you. Be not dismayed. I am your God. I will strengthen you." Not I can. I will strengthen you. I will help you. I will uphold you with my righteous right hand. This passage, what it does, it tells us really the two biggest enemies in our trials. Fear not, fear, anxiety. For I am with you. Be not dismayed. Being dismayed, being discouraged, being in despair. Isaiah says, and it sounds just simple, it says, don't be afraid. Don't be dismayed. All right, okay, I won't be. This is not easy. But he comes and he says, why? Don't fear. Because, why? Because God is with you. He is present. He is in your circumstances. His redemption is alive and working in it all. Then he says, don't be discouraged. Don't be dismayed. Why? Because God will strengthen you. Now, you may not see it, you may not feel it in the moment, but God is going to show up. He's going to strengthen you. He's going to help you. He's going to hold you up. That's a promise, and he will do it. It's not he can, he might, he will. Ruth stepped toward God in her grief and loss. She stepped toward God in her desperation and her destitution. She trusted God even though she couldn't see his hand at work. Naomi says, "Stay with your people there in Moab. I'm going back to," you've got hope here. You might get married again you just go back to your home. She says, "No, I'm setting all that behind. I'm laying my gods, my people. Naomi, your people will be my people. Your God will be my God. I am taking the risk. I am trusting in your God. I am with you and I am with him." And God blessed. He held her up. He strengthened her. He helped her every moment of her journey. She trusted God even though she couldn't see his work in her life. Yet all the while, God's redemption was running deep. Friend, if you're in the middle of a trial right now, I want to ask you I want you to step toward God rather than away from God. Step toward him. God has not abandoned you. He has not forgotten you. As I said, he is at work. Sometimes you just can't feel it. You can't feel it, but he is right there. He will strengthen you and help you and uphold you. I've seen this in my own life. 2012, after almost 2 months in the hospital, after a long, hard surgery, and then getting an infection that was not good. God was at work, even in those times that I'm laying in bed, couldn't get out, and just feeling despondent, struggling with depression. But yet God held me in my weakness. He carried me through recovery. I couldn't see it. I couldn't feel him. It was hard even just, and I hate to say this as a pastor, it was hard just even opening up the word. It was hard to even pray. There's times I like, all right, John, just, okay, he's got you. He's got you. I just have to say that. All right, I'm just going to read a few verses. Open up the Psalm. Okay, God, I need you in my life. That's all I could just muster out. That was enough. And God walked with me. He was there. His redemption. I just get teary thinking about it. His redemption was running deep. We had tried for years to get pregnant after our two boys. I mean, month after month, you think, hey, this is it, and then disappointment. You try again in the next month, disappointment. We tried fertility treatments, none of it worked. Yet God was at work. God was at work in my life, my wife's life. Though we couldn't see it, He was preparing us. Even after a failed adoption, God was preparing us for our daughter Bethany. You know, when God was leading us recently out of Fayetteville about 2.5 years ago, calling us to uproot from our ministry, from our friends, from our church family, God was at work in our lives. He was at work there in Fayetteville. And friends, He was at work here, all that you guys were going through. And somehow God orchestrated y'all's lives and our lives to come together. God was at work. We didn't understand what He was doing or the plans that He had for us, but now we rejoice in all that He's done. We can see it now. We can see it. He's given us a new ministry. He's given us sweet new friendships. He's given us a church family. Like this morning, just sitting down there watching everyone coming in, sitting there singing, looking around. Oh, I am so thankful that I get to be your pastor. Friends, I could give you a dozen more times when we have faced challenges in our lives, our family, and had to trust Him in the unknown. And in it all, God's redemption runs deep. And here I want to get real specific about how this plays out in real time here at First Baptist in your life. First, there's some of you here today, and you've been through some storms. You've been through the fires. You've walked there. You've been through it. You've seen. Maybe you didn't see it at first, but now that you're through it, you're able to look back and go, oh man, I can see it. You may not have been tempted to walk away from the Lord, but by His grace, you decided to trust Him and to move toward Him rather than away from Him. You didn't see His redemptive hand at work at first, but as you look back, you see His fingerprints all over the place. You know what I'm talking about? Some of you have done that. Some of you have done that. And if this describes you, friend, we need to hear your stories. You need to share those stories. In those moments that I just shared about our lives, there were sweet friends who came and just would share their stories of how God, in their trials, I mean, they didn't see it, and they were maybe in the same place I was at, and they just said, man, God helped. And I would hear their stories, and it would just uplift me and encourage me and kind of help me to press on. Friends, there are people here in our church right now who need to hear those stories. They need to hear you share of how God's redemption has run deep in your life. Encourage one another with those stories. Paul calls us to do that very thing. 1 Thessalonians 5:11 says, therefore encourage one another and build one another up, just as you're doing. We need to be a church where encouragement is just, the stories are just popping up all over the place. We need to hear those. Friends, this is your step. If you've been there, your next step is to share your story. Find somebody. I tell you what, find somebody that's in that trial right now and share your story. Share your story. In fact, Angela and I, we did that just this past week. We just began talking about, remember that? It's just sweet. We just doing that. Hey, man, look at, now that we're here, we can look back and God did this, He did this. We didn't see it at the time. But, I mean, we just mentioned 4, 5, 6 things that we've seen how God has shown Himself, how He was present, He was working even when we didn't see it, and it was a blessing. So share with your spouse. Just take some time and say, man, let's talk about how God's been with us. Look back over our past, through some of those trials, and just talk about it. Maybe share it with a friend. Share it with someone who's in the middle of that storm. Second, you might be here, And you're one of those who are in the midst of a storm. Maybe it's a marital battle. Maybe it's a financial battle, a health battle. I don't know what it is, what your storm is, fire is. You may be here this morning and you're thinking, I'm on the brink of just chunking the towel in. This whole thing, this whole Christian thing, I don't know. Maybe that trial has so battered you that you're just numb, immobilized. Friend, this is when you need to trust him the most. And take that step toward him. Hebrews 11:1 speaks about that, about faith. He says, now faith is the assurance of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen. The things of hope. In other words, faith is like, I'm not experiencing it right now. I don't see it, but I'm going to look off into the future because I'm going to bank in a God that's bigger than my problems, that's bigger than my trials. I'm going to look off into that direction, and I'm going to place my hope there. I'm going to, even though I can't see it, I trust God's going to lead me there. That's what he's talking about here. And if you want to be really encouraged, just read the rest of that, and you'll see all these people who faced all kinds of trials in the Bible. And they had to just trust in what they couldn't see. My pastor friend, I mentioned him last week. He was in an accident, working in a burn pile, and something exploded, and he had severe burns on his face and his arms. You know, he got out of ICU, or out of the burn unit this week, made his way into the rehab. Pretty intensive rehab. He's laid up. He had to relearn to walk. And you know what he had to do? That first day of rehab, you know what they had him do? Take a first step. All right, let's get you up. And they put a belt around you, and everybody, got people on each side, and they're holding him, and you're standing there. Hey, I've been there, and your legs are kind of quivering, and you're holding. You're like, all right, let's take a step, and then you're there, and you're like, okay, and it takes everything you got, and you take a step, and you're out of breath, and you're like, all right, you did it, and you rejoice, and he's like, all right, you know what's next? What's next? Step number 2. You take another step. I saw pictures this week. He's now walking with a cane, and here soon he's hoping to go back home in another week, walking completely on his own without assistance. Friend, if you're in the midst of a trial, sometimes you just need to take a step of faith. Like, what does that look like? What does it look like? Your step of faith may simply be saying those truths that we've been talking about. I mean, just saying them, repeating them over and over until they kind of sink in and get into your heart. God is at work in my trial. I had to do that in that hospital bed. I said, God is at work. I can't see. God is at work. God has not forgotten me. God's redemption runs deep. That's a good phrase. Bank on that one. Just keep saying it. God's redemption runs deep. I can trust him. And that's a simple step, but it's a good first step. Just say it. God's redemption is running deep. Another first step might be taking maybe a spiritual risk. Faith always requires some kind of risk. We saw it in Ruth's life. Leaving Moab, going out into the grain field, going to the threshing floor. I mean, she's always taking risks. Faith requires risks. There's no spiritual reward without spiritual risk. Ruth took numerous risks. Maybe for you, just that step, that risk is opening up and actually sharing your struggle with someone. Sharing your struggle, being open and honest and real and sharing, hey, I'm really struggling here. Here's a fear, or here's a sin I've been hiding, and I want to share it with you. Would you bear this with me? Maybe in your life group. Our life groups are places where we gather around the Word, but they're places where we share, we're vulnerable, we open up to one another, we care for one another, and we can share those kinds of things. And we know that those friends, those dear loved ones will wrap their arms around us and pray. Maybe you've been in a life group, and that step of faith was like, you know what, I've been just holding this back. I need to take that step of faith, and I'm going to share. I'm going to share that prayer request. I'm leading a men's life group on Wednesday nights, and it's just been sweet. We gather around and just trying to sharpen one another, and then we take some time to pray, and some of the men will share some things, and it's just sweet being vulnerable and open. A couple of the guys shared this past week, and it's just been sweet because it's been in my heart and my mind all week long, and I've been lifting them up to the Lord. Life group. If you're not in a life group, friend, you're missing out. Stop by Connect Point, grab one of those sheets, talk to Ryan, talk to anybody. We'd love to get you connected to a life group. We'll help you take those steps. Maybe a simple step is maybe like where I was in that hospital bed, and you just, when you're numb and you're just so down, sometimes just the simplest of prayer. Maybe that's that first step. Oh, God, give me faith today to trust you. Just that step. God, give me the faith to trust you in the storm. And then watch what he does. You know, there may be others of you here today who are going through the trial right now, or maybe will soon head into the trial, and you don't have a church home. You don't have a faith family that you can call, hey, this is mine. This is where I belong. This is my family. Maybe you've been attending First for a while now, but just haven't made that next step. And it's fine. Sometimes that process takes some time. You're seeking the Lord. Friends, you were created to be in community. You were created to be in a community of faith. And friends, this is a great church to belong to. You're like, man, you're biased though. Well, of course I am. But I've experienced it. It's a wonderful church to be a part of, a place to find encouragement and be lifted up during those stormy days. It's a great group of people to serve alongside like we did yesterday. I mean, that was just fun. That was so fun. You know, so joining up with a serve team. We've got Connect Point. Go back out there. We got all kinds of serve teams for ways for you to serve children. I mean, just all kinds of ways. In fact, when you're down, when depression and when things just kind of turn inward, another great step is just to get out of yourself and serve others. Get in a serve team and start serving others, and you'll find that even in that trial, things will just lift. If you don't have a church family, maybe you've been attending a while and think, man, maybe this is the place. Right? You heard Ryan earlier. Next week, I'll lead our Step 1 class. It may go 45 minutes, but we have some good snacks. We've actually expanded our snack choices. So come on. Scan that code. Scan that code and come be a part of our class next week. Find out a little bit more about our church and ways to get connected. And lastly, there's others of you who've already walked away, maybe have walked away from the church. And maybe I'm talking to some folks online. You've walked away from the Lord. The battles have come. It's just been too hard. You said, I can't do this anymore. You know, Ruth's sister-in-law, she did that. Orpha was her name. And she didn't go back with Ruth and Naomi. She decided, no, I'll go back and I'm going to hang out here. And we don't hear about her anymore in the scripture. Then there's that nearest kin, Mr. So-and-so. He's there at the gate, and he could have stepped out and said, all right, well, hey, I'm the kin here. Yeah, it's my responsibility. I'll take a step of faith, and I'll build a mother-in-law house. I'll Yeah, I'll take Naomi. She's a Moabite. Well, yeah, okay, yeah, I'll take her. But he's like, no, thanks. Mr. So we don't even have his name. And then after this, he walks off. We never hear from him again. Biggest tragedy, I think, in walking away is missing God's redeeming work in their life. Oh, if Orpha had just gone with them and to experience all of that. Again, maybe you're listening. Maybe you're listening online. I want to encourage you right now to walk back to the Lord. Walk back to his church. For some of you, and maybe many of you in here, you know some people who've been hurt or maybe even been wounded by the church. Sadly, the church, we're not perfect. We're just not perfect. We won't be that until that day. But walking away from the church isn't the answer. We're just broken people in need of God's redeeming work. Come back and find a family of faith, a place to call home as we journey together toward that ultimate home, that ultimate promised land, heaven. Friend, what is your next step? Every one of you have a next step. I've listed a whole bunch of them. I want you to just take a moment. What is your next step? What do you need to do? In what way do you need to show faith? God is at work in your life. His redemption is running deep. It's all around. You may not see him, but you can trust him. What is your next step? Think about it. Closing out the sermon series, I want to point out one last way that I think redemption unfolds. Looking back at that passage that I just read, Ruth gives birth to a son. It's incredible. The women of the city, they rejoice and they give praise to God. And they tell Naomi that the Lord has given her a redeemer. You have a redeemer. But verse 15, if you saw it there, it says that this redeemer, it isn't Boaz. Did you notice who the redeemer is? It's the son. The redeemer is the son. It's baby Obed. That's a good name for you. That name means the one who serves. He serves as their redeemer. Hope had dawned. Then in the genealogy that closes out the chapter, we read that Obed becomes the father of Jesse. You're like, oh, okay, whatever. Jesse becomes the father of David. You're like, okay, whatever. Well, David is the King David, through whose line makes its way to another king. Ruth and Boaz are the great grandparents of King David, through whom the lineage will come another baby who will be born in Bethlehem. This baby would also be the one who would serve. In fact, this one, the scripture says he didn't come to be served, he came to serve and to give his life as a ransom, as a payment for many. This baby born in Bethlehem from the lineage of David and from Ruth is none other than Jesus, God's son. God was at work in Ruth and Naomi's life in way bigger ways than they ever saw. They never saw this. God was at work carrying out a redemptive plan that would touch you and me today. God was at work. He was carrying out this redemptive plan that weaved its way through their lives and made its way up to a cross and to an empty tomb and, friend, into your life today. That's our God. That's the God of redemption. You know, when we turned away from God to go our own way, our lives were in spiritual ruins. Spiritual ruins. Like the people of Israel in bondage to the Egyptians, we were all in bondage to our sin. We were all subjected to its shame, its guilt, and its penalty. And there was nothing that we could do to escape. Nothing that we could do in our own strength. We needed a redeemer. Like Ruth and Naomi, who needed a kinsman redeemer to bring them out of ruin and redemption. That's what we needed. Like Boaz, Jesus was willing to leave heaven and walk the earthly road of redemption. Like Boaz, Jesus was willing to make the sacrifice required. Boaz purchased the land. Jesus came and purchased us by his blood. Like Boaz, Jesus paid the full price of redemption by going to a cross and paying the debt that we could not pay. Like Boaz did for Ruth, Jesus brings us, friend, into a new family. He gives us a new name, a new inheritance called eternal life. And friend, to receive this immeasurable gift, we simply must turn to him and trust him, just like Ruth did. To leave it behind and say, yes, Jesus. Yes, Jesus. Friend, will you turn and trust in him? Friend, will you just drop whatever it is and say yes to Jesus? And when you do, that redemption will come alive. You will be renewed, restored, brought to life, set free, redeemed. Redeemed, how I love to proclaim it. Redeemed by the blood of the Lamb, the old hymn says. Redeemed, how I love to proclaim it. Friends, let's take the next step. Let's pray together.